Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and as ever, we are in the studio with ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin. In our last discussion, we talked about the digital connectivity that exposes hidden dangers. In this conversation, we're here to discuss theme number 2 of our Threat Horizon 2021 series, how the digital Cold War engulfs business. A digital Cold War is looming. The race to develop strategically important next-generation technologies is laying the foundation for nation-state-backed espionage, where intellectual property is targeted. Cloud services will become a prime target for sabotage by those seeking to cause disruption to society and to business. Drones will become the weapon and target of choice as attackers turn their attention skywards. Steve, industrial espionage is nothing new, but talk to us about how it's evolving and what the main techniques will be for attackers.
I think one of the really interesting themes that we've pulled out in this year's Threat Horizon is this issue around industrial espionage. One of the ways in which it's changing is we are seeing it becoming very much more state-backed. Why is that happening? Well, I think it's for 2 reasons. The first is that technology now is clearly an economic growth driver. And so that means that nation states are interested in how they can use that to drive forward their own strategies, their own plans for growing their environments. So that's the first thing. I think it's very much more important to nation states than it's been in the past. I think that the second thing about it is that technology is really fueling this next generation of industrial revolution. And so it isn't just a nice to have. It is critical. It is central to the way in which we will continue to live and operate. And so therefore, there is a very much heightened interest in being able to understand what other people are producing. And there is clearly a need to try to steal some form of market advantage. And so I think the net effect of all of that is that organizations that are developing technologies such as artificial intelligence, 5G, robotics, quantum computing, for instance, will find their intellectual property systematically being targeted by nation-state-backed actors who are really trying to gain some edge, battling, if you like, for some form of technological or associated economic supremacy in that particular area. And, industrial espionage has been around for a very long time. It's nothing new. We've talked in the past about pharmaceutical companies just about to bring a drug to market only to find that it's already been put out on the market, perhaps in Southeast Asia and so on. So this isn't new. But I think that the way in which we're now seeing it shifting very much more into being nation-state backed, where there isn't the concern about, okay, if I've now stolen intellectual property, how do I monetize it? Because the infrastructure for monetization is there and has been trialed. Those are real changes and evolutionary steps that we've seen in this particular space, I think. And interestingly, it is taking us into an environment where, from a business standpoint, we need to be taking a slightly different look at some of the security controls that we're putting in place to protect our intellectual property in this space. So it is about things like implementing physical security controls. It isn't just about cyber. It's about how do we, restrict access, physical access, for instance. You mentioned drones. How do we prevent drones potentially spying on what we're up to? Those are all physical elements. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that a number of our members are actually transitioning some of their security people into being responsible not just for cyber, but also for physical security. And so there is this coming together, I think, a realization of the fact that security is a much bigger issue than perhaps it has been in the past. And so I think, organizations do have to look at how they can protect themselves better against espionage. They obviously need to be reviewing the different legal controls that are available to them as it relates to some of their high-value intellectual property, because this certainly isn't something that's going to go away. And I think that the fact that it is state-backed really does give an indication as to the seriousness, which of course presents a challenge for a lot of organizations in terms of protecting that intellectual property.
Right. Organizations are not only increasingly reliant on the cloud, but on a small number of providers, such as Google or Amazon, that dominate the field. How do organizations create a fail-safe against attacks on cloud services providers that support large and critical elements of their business infrastructure?
It's a really topical question, and one that I think is keeping a lot of people up at night. We're currently conducting some pretty significant research in this space on behalf of our members and should be producing the report associated with that towards the back end of 2019. And we've done a lot of work in this space before, but I think that, this shift towards very much more information being stored in a cloud environment, the number of providers being much smaller than they were in the past, is changing things. So the challenge is that attackers will aim to sabotage cloud services. There's no doubt about that. Why? Because there is so much more information being held up there, and it does again relate to not just business but also government type data. So critical national infrastructure raises its head again in this particular space. Attacks on the cloud have the ability to have significant impact, crippling in some instances supply chains or compromising, vast quantities of data. And some organizations will become collateral damage because they happen to be related to other organizations when cloud services go down. Mm-hmm. So I think that the real challenge in this particular space is for organizations, how do they really recognize the role that they have to play in conjunction with their cloud service provider? Because yes, the cloud service provider is going to be responsible for providing an infrastructure, but they're not going to assume responsibility for the data that you store up there.
Right.
And indeed, we're starting to see very much more slicing in terms of the services that these providers operate and provide. And what I mean by that is that as a business, you can choose the level of security that you want to have applied to some of the data and systems that you have up there. And so we start to get into this risk assessment. What is it worth to me? I think that the other point that you make, though, about there being a small number of providers is worth just talking about as well, in that certainly the likes of Amazon, for instance, Google, do have the ability to provide a much higher degree of security around the data that's stored in the cloud than perhaps an SME would be able to. A small to mid-sized business simply doesn't have the resources available to do that kind of thing. And so I think that for organizations, the task is actually relatively simple. They need to profile how cloud services are really being used across their own business and across their supply chains, and look long and hard at the contractual arrangements that they've got in place, along with the business continuity plans that are there. So you plan for the day when something goes wrong, when you can't access your information. But I think that the key piece to it is to really understand the level of security that you want to have around the data that you're storing with a cloud provider. Recognize that you are responsible for that. And as I say, that's going to require some pretty sophisticated risk assessment to be carried out. And, our members are doing that on an ongoing basis using some of our tools, such as our benchmark tool or our IRAM2 tool, that enables them to get a much better grip on what is valuable and the risks associated with it.
Mm-hmm. As we've been discussing, the threat landscape is expanding into the cloud and, with drones, into the skies. Whose responsibility is it to regulate these infinite and intangible spaces?
Drones are a relatively new development, certainly in the commercial space. I mean, they've been tested certainly in battlefield-type environments. And I think that one of the things that we call out in the report is the requirement for a much better understanding of the way in which drone technology is emerging, is developing, and indeed is being used. And the question that you posed there is around regulation. We are seeing some relaxing in terms of the way in which drones can fly. So across Europe, certainly they will be able to fly above 400 feet. That may cause some challenges, particularly for aircraft. We saw at the back end of 2018 and the start of 2019, of course, both Gatwick and Heathrow airports in the UK being really hit by a drone flying around the airfield. And so they are introducing things that perhaps we haven't anticipated or understood as being relevant. And, when we talk about regulation, I think one of the challenges with regulation is that it is always lagging the reality of what is taking place. And that's a very real concern, I think, for everybody. Here in the United States, there are over something like 100,000 drone pilots registered with the FAA. And so I don't think anybody is in any doubt as to the role that drones will be playing. The challenge is, how do we really apply the right level of controls to protect against malicious drone usage and indeed remediate vulnerabilities in any of the drone deployment initiatives that we might have as an organization. And, drones do have a very valuable role to play in terms of monitoring, again, things like oil pipelines in remote locations, the way in which crops might be growing or not in certain locations. And so, again, it's one of these situations where we have to balance out the benefit with the potential threat. I think we will see more regulation. There's no doubt about that. I think it needs to be sensible regulation, however. And unfortunately, I think that means that we're going to have some cases where things go wrong before we get that legislation and regulation catching up. But certainly, I think for everybody, drones are going to become very much more commonplace, and we're going to really accept that they're here to stay.
Mm-hmm. The digital Cold War will involve attacks that will be very difficult to attribute. Chaos may descend rapidly, but may be diffused quickly, too. Organizations will need to evaluate the technologies that underpin their operating and service models to understand if they may become a prime target during this period of uncertainty. Supply chains will require re-evaluation, and crisis management and business continuity plans will need to be updated before critical infrastructure and core services are hit. In the next and final episode in our special Threat Horizon 2021 series, I want to sit down to discuss with you the Threat Horizon Theme 3, Digital Competitors Rip Up the Rulebook. So thank you again, Steve, for enlightening our listeners and giving us a preview about what's coming in the future. And for more information about the tools and resources offered by the ISF, please visit securityforum.org.